Thank you all for coming on this cold, one of the first really cold nights of the fall. My name is Diane Proctor. This is Michael Ansara. This is his fantastic book called The Hard Work of Hope, a Memoir, about which I will be talking with him this evening. I have the privilege of sitting on the Reclaim Our Democracy Committee here in First Parish. And before we begin, I have a message, as we would say, from our sponsors. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by a variety of organizations. Reclaim Our Democracy, sometimes referred to as ROD, was formed here in First Parish in Concord in 2016. And you might guess why it was started in 2016, a rather interesting date, with the goal to reclaim our democratic rights as citizens of the United States of America and to have a government that truly represents and supports the needs and desires of all people. We have organized, Reclaim Our Democracy has organized many events with nationally known speakers, such as our distinguished guest tonight. One of the members of our Reclaim Our Democracy group left in 2018 to form Concord Indivisible, a very successful group in town with people from Concord and surrounding towns dedicated to preserving our democracy and promoting progressive values. And some of the leaders of that organization are here, and welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. And finally, Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice is a national organization based in Washington, D.C., with the mission of advancing equitable national policies and actions aligned with UU values through engagement, education, and advocacy. So I want to thank our many sponsors, and the League of Women Voters is also supporting here in Concord and Carlisle this event tonight. And now for our main event. Michael, it has been so exciting reading your book, The Hard Work of Hope, a Memoir, and recalling those days in the 60s when we were all on fire on so many issues, but mainly Vietnam, civil rights, and governmental deceit and corruption. Remember LBJ and Johnson and everything that swirled around all of that? Oh, and I said LBJ, did I say, who did I say? LBJ and Nixon. That was my husband editing, so reminding me. Thank you, Alan. You were on the side you were on one side of the Charles River organizing, and I was doing the same on the other side at Boston University. A couple of years older than you, I was organizing teach-ins and sleep-ins, and believe it or not, we were trying to learn where Vietnam was and something about its history. Led by fiery professors like Murray Levin and Howard Zinn, we spent hours studying and trying to understand what this seemingly remote war was all about. In retrospect, we were so young, so full of optimism, and so wonderfully naive. I have 1,000 questions, Michael, but we have only 45 minutes, and then we must turn the microphone over to the audience. So here is the first. Your organizational lodestone at Harvard became SDS, Students for Democratic Society, an organization that you would eventually influence nationally. Why SDS, Michael?
So I had spent my high school years active primarily in civil rights. There was a wonderful group of black organizers in Roxbury and Dorchester who, for reasons that I can't understand, adopted me. I mean, I was very young. I started when I was 13, and they treated me as if I was an adult and took me in and taught me organizing. And then in 1962, I volunteered on the campaign of H. Stuart Hughes,
I'm going to mention that.
somewhat neurotic Harvard professor who ran as an independent against Ted Kennedy. And I met a number of the students who were working for him who introduced me to SDS, and I read something called the Port Huron Statement, which was a real generational declaration. And I had been convinced by the civil rights movement that organizing was essential. Not that protests weren't important and not that actions weren't important, but I really believed that organizing and building popular organizations. And I wanted to build a new student movement. You know, somehow in that, I went to Harvard in the fall of 1964, and somehow I just felt in my bones that we could build a new student movement. But I wanted it to be multi-issue. I wanted it to be part of what I hoped would be a new left, a left rooted in American experience, American language, and American democracy. And so SDS was that. And it was small. My first month at Harvard, we got the Civil Rights Coordinating Committee, including many students who'd been to Mississippi that summer, Toxin, which was a peace organization, a number of other organizations, all to join in creating a serious SDS chapter at Harvard. And then, you know, I look back on it, I don't understand myself. For some reason, I had 2 jobs at Harvard. I entered as an advanced standing freshman. I was organizing the SDS chapter, and I was going regularly down to Providence, Rhode Island to pursue my high school sweetheart to become my wife. And on top of all that, I thought it was just fine to become one of 2 regional organizers for SDS and travel New England, finding people to start SDS chapters. In those days, you know, it was all pre-computer. So I would go to campuses and I would find often the campus ministry, they would know who were the most active. Or in the small colleges, I would literally go to the library and get out, go to the library, look at the C. Wright Mills and Marcuse books, and in the back, they'd have the cards where you signed out, and I'd see who was signing out the right
Can you
books.
imagine doing that today? First of all, you couldn't find the cards, but then...
But SDS offered me a multi-issue organization with a rich intellectual life and a commitment to organizing, and a vocabulary and analysis that was rooted in American experience and American history.
That's fantastic, Michael. You know, so I'm going to, a second question to kind of grow off of that one. Can you elucidate some of the intellectual tensions, which you speak about so beautifully in your book, within SDS, by giving us perhaps a simple example, and that with an eye towards something that I think is so prevalent right now, is do divisions in organizations ultimately destroy them or strengthen them? Do divisions of ideas divide them or strengthen them? And what did they do to you when you were a young man growing up within an organization?
So SDS thought of itself, and I certainly thought of myself and our organization as a new left that had broken completely with all forms of the old left. And we were rejecting not just the communist and socialist parties, the Trotskyist organizations and the Maoists and Marxists, but we were also rejecting corporate liberals, and we were rejecting the social democratic left that was rooted in the Cold War. You have to remember in early 1960s, the Cold War still was the dominant frame within which everything was cast. And we thought it was stultifying and preventing original thought, and that the main thing that was going on in the world was not simply the struggle between communism and democracy, but was also what was happening in the former colonized countries that were breaking free, what was happening in poor societies around the world struggling for liberation, but also there were issues of bureaucracy and consumerism and technology, and you couldn't fit everything in the world into the frame of communism, democracy. And that meant we thought of ourselves as anti-communists. So we didn't like communism, but we didn't like the frame of anti-communism. Now this is really important because what we did not understand is that as SDS grew enormously, there would be Marxist-Leninist organizations that would decide they wanted to penetrate and organize within SDS. And we were completely unprepared for that.
Oh, McCarthy told us that's what would happen. Yeah.
But we just had no way of comprehending that. And at Harvard, for example, there was a particularly effective one called the Progressive Labor Party, and its Worker-Student Alliance. It didn't have any workers in it, but it had a lot of appeal to so many of the guilt-ridden elite students at places like Harvard who were anguished by what was happening and their parents' role in it. And also, as the world got more and more complex, and in particular in 68 and 69, as anything seemed possible, and the most unexpected headlines greeted you every week, every day, many students, we were so young, and we felt the weight of the war so heavily that we turned to very simplistic understandings of the world. And so the organization that I had joined and helped build, which was to be a New Left organization, which rejected all of the orthodoxies and ridiculous behavior and simplistic beliefs of the old left, by 1968 and 1969 was becoming a farcical replica of all that. So in that sense, those kinds of tensions were very destructive, and the organization in 1969 blew apart into two factions, each of which was weirder than the other. And I had no more home, which was, for me, a sad event. And so in those circumstances, those kinds of divisions and tensions were highly destructive, but I think it was in the context, and we were, as you said, so young. We had to find where Vietnam was on a map.
Yeah,
we had to learn the history. We had to learn, and every day by 1967 and 68, I was waking up asking the question, could I be good enough? Because the weight of stopping the war was on our shoulders, no one else's. No one was coming to save us. And so every day I thought, if I'm not good enough, more people will die. And that weight, I think, for many students, was crippling and crushing. And so what I had started out to build in '64 was nothing like what we ended up building. I thought I was going to build a new left. I spent 10 years building opposition to a war in Vietnam, and in many ways lost a lot of what was valuable in the New Left. The New Left really was born of profound optimism, the optimism of the civil rights movement, which was so much of a moral center and an optimistic movement based on love and redemption. And that's what gave us our impetus, and it was based on hope. And by 1969, most of that was lost.
Well, it was a bitter time, and it was a complicated time. Michael, you have always been a self-confessed troublemaker.
Yes.
Since you were a young boy. What are the roots in your personal and intellectual life that created such iconoclasm?
So they're the roots that I know about, and they're the roots that I've pieced together since.
But a memoir gives you a chance to think about those roots.
And by the way, I've got another memoir I'm working on that goes into this in more detail.
Okay.
So in one sense, the simple answer is I loved American history and fled into it at an early age. And when I read Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, I thought, the pursuit of happiness? What a wonderful phrase. What a wonderful idea. And I was in love with America. And so that's, in one sense, the origin. But the other is my family. My family was rather strange. I didn't know much of my family's history. When I was growing up, there were no political discussions that I remember. They didn't have many friends. They didn't go out very often. My father had a really hard time holding on to a job. But they did instill certain values, and they sent me, most importantly, when I was young, we lived in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. We lived in Alexandria, and I was sent to the only integrated school in the Commonwealth of Virginia. There was literally one, Burgundy Farm Country Day School, which was a wonderful, integrated, black and white, experiential learning school that I loved beyond belief. And it's interesting because I never thought about it as integrated. I was completely oblivious to color,
Yeah.
you know? But it clearly shaped a lot of my values and a lot of my beliefs. Now, I've since learned that both my parents were communists in the 1930s, that my mother was a painter, my father was a writer. My mother stopped painting, my father stopped writing. He went into the State Department in the Second World War, and the year that I was born, he was fired as a security risk. I never knew those things until I was grown up. So obviously they passed on those values, and it was not uncommon that the first wave of organizers for SDS came either from communist or socialist families, or ex-communist and ex-socialist families, or from very active New Deal Democratic families. And that was the first wave that started SDS. But when we decided to call for the first March on Washington, that December of 1964, we called it for April of the following year, we didn't realize that we were becoming the spear tip of a new anti-war movement that would bring in tens of thousands of students, many of them from conservative families, and who didn't necessarily share our perspective, but were absolutely furious about the war. So anyway, I think it was that my family played a large role in it, but for some reason that I wasn't aware of at the time, I was 13 years old. I was absolutely, who can remember being 13? You remember being 13, how miserable you were? I was in complete adolescent despair. You know, acne, sick, limping, sometimes on crutches, unhappy with my family. We didn't have any money. I had to work starting at 12. And one day I walked by a picket line outside a Woolworth store, talked to the folks there. They were supporting the sit-in in Greensboro, North Carolina. They explained to me what they were doing, and I stepped into that line and absolutely transformed my life, pulled me out of adolescent despair into hope and into the belief that organizing can change the world.
I want you to know, this is a young boy who, and some of us will remember this well, when they said that there was going to be an atomic bomb, that what you did was crawl under your desk. Remember, your eyeballs would melt? Do you remember being told if you looked out the window? I mean, it was years before I could look out a window when there was a loud noise. Anyway, Michael wouldn't crawl under the desk. He said, that's ridiculous. That wouldn't save us at all. So when I'm saying he was a rebel, he was a rebel in the most wonderful sensibility. In your work, you speak of Fannie Lou Hamer, who we all love. Moral, and the citation he says is moral weight and deep well of determination, as she radiated outrage. In her battles for civil rights in Mississippi, she and others resulted in part in your, quote, quiet courage in the face of hatred and violence, and in particular in your strong concerns about racism. What lessons have you learned from that aspect of your activism, Michael? And do you think we have made progress since the 60s? When you look at the Supreme Court dismantling the Civil Rights Act, et cetera, but that's for you to answer, not for me to.
So the answer is we made enormous progress. And it's a shame that many people don't recognize that progress, but we haven't made nearly enough progress. And now, pretty much since the election of Barack Obama, there has been a concerted backlash seeking to reverse that progress. And I think we've learned over and over again that race is one of the absolute fractures of politics. I feel like the profound economic inequality and race are the two things that more than anything else shape our politics and warp it, absolutely warp it. And so immigration becomes an issue of race and becomes an issue of economic desperation and inequality. But I think there's no question. I mean, you've got to remember, I can remember that there were 26 states where
a man and a woman of separate races could not marry. That there were laws that said, not just in the South, that
Oh, no.
a man and a woman of separate races were not allowed to marry. There, in 1962 in Boston, not only was there profound housing segregation, there was not a single bank, not one, that had a senior executive who was black. There was not a single law firm, not a single law firm, that had a senior partner that was black. Of all the colleges and universities in Massachusetts, there was one black dean who was not an academic dean. He was the dean of Marsh Chapel at Boston University. And he was the only one. Well, now look today. There is, a thriving black middle class, and legal segregation has been overthrown. Now we face an attempt to bring it back. The problem, of course, is that we never were able, the civil rights movement, to redress the economic inequalities brought about by the history of racism. If you look particularly at housing segregation, and you look at what happened to American families at the end of the Second World War, there was a vast effort that moved millions of white families into the middle class, particularly into owning their own homes, going to college, and many of those benefits were explicitly denied to returning GIs who were black and their families. And there's never been a redress of that, and that's why we have, even in Massachusetts, this profound racial wealth gap. So there is enormous work to be done, and we're now under assault from a white supremacist, reactionary political force that has seized control of the federal government. But at the same time, we should never forget the enormous strides that the civil rights movement actually brought about. It changed this country.
And Stacey Abrams becomes in so many ways, in her activist movement right now, presently, she just the other day mentioned Fannie Lou Harris and Hammond, and she was for me, she said, growing up, a wonderful model. And I don't know if you've all followed what Stacey Abrams is doing in Georgia, but it's pretty impressive. I would have brought a loaf of Wonder Bread with me tonight, but can you share why the Continental Baking Company was important in your growth as an organizer, and why that action or others like it serve as a model for those eager to challenge the mega corporations today? I would add, for those of you who don't know, Wonder Bread was the staple bread on almost every American table. And as a little girl, I can remember avidly trying to collect the little patches, the little stickers on the end of the Wonder Bread. Does anybody else, you all remember doing? Well, I was very eager to collect them. And anyway, Wonder Bread was a big company. So talk to us about why it mattered, that action, and what, as people today look at various organizations they would like to challenge. What did you learn, and what can you teach us?
So it was 1962. There was that profound racism in hiring and employment that I mentioned. And there was a group, as I mentioned, of black organizers led by Noel Day, who was the social worker at St. Mark's, the Reverend Jim Breeden from the Episcopal Church, a very young organizer named Sarah Ann Shaw, who you will have known as a journalist over all these years, who at that point was an actual organizer, and Byron Rushing, who became a state rep. And they had a little group that they formed called the Boston Action Group, and I was added miraculously. I can't explain it, why this 15-year-old kid got into that circle, but they trained me. And so we went door to door, and we did a survey in the black community, South End, Roxbury, North Dorchester, of what people bought. And we talked, as we did the survey, we talked about using economic power, that we shouldn't spend money where we can't get jobs. Notice, by the way, I slip into we.
It never occurred to me. I never thought I was black, but, you know, as part of this group, I was legitimate and able to go door to door. And so we built a network of block captains on virtually every block in the black neighborhoods. And we identified what people shopped, what they bought. And of course, everybody brought Wonder Bread, the ubiquitous white bread. And it was produced by the Continental Baking Company, as Diane says, which had a factory in the middle of Roxbury, right in the middle of Roxbury, and refused to hire black folks for anything other than the least paid, lowest, most menial jobs in the factory, right in the middle of Roxbury. And so we decided that they should be our first target and that we should make them an object lesson. And so we got everybody to agree to boycott Wonder Bread, and the block captains to remind everybody on their blocks every week not to buy Wonder Bread. And week after week, their sales fell, and they at first refused to even negotiate with us, and then they said, well, maybe they would, and then finally they negotiated, and finally, we won, I can't remember, it was 7 or 8 good-paying jobs, and broke the racist discrimination at the Continental Baking Company. And then the very threat of a boycott had companies, employers scrambling. So banks, for example, were the next target, and they fell all over themselves to bring in senior black executives in training programs, and the same with law firms and so on. And it taught me that organizing works. That was my first real participation, not in protest, but in organizing. And I saw it work. And I understood the hours and hours of patient, hard work, what I call the hard work of hope, that you have to do to build grassroots organizations that can wield significant power. And it convinced me that we need to use economic power along with all of the other forms of our power, the vote, disruption, protest, and so on. And so I'm thrilled to see today the effective boycotts that are going on. And, you know, we saw the most vivid display of what a boycott can do.
We sure did.
With Jimmy Kimmel back on the air.
With Jimmy Kimmel.
And, you know, that, I think, also showed people the truth, which is, yes, we are in a hard, desperate, urgent fight, but we do have power, and we can win.
And so to organize in that, can you magnify that in a larger tapestry with all social media and everything else? How would you produce that same perhaps model, the door-to-door kind of model, given social media, in order to organize genuine concerns about companies that are investing in one way or another? Oh, wait, there are a lot of them investing right now in nothing else of rebuilding the East Wing.
So, you know, I think the larger the company, the larger the boycott needed, the harder it is to do. But we do have technology, and the technology has both significant pluses and significant minuses. So the plus is what we all know, which is that we can use social media to reach large numbers of people really instantaneously. And so that gives us a reach, and we can get people to sign up. The problem with social media is that we think that we've built something that way. And unless it goes viral and takes off on its own, we have not built lasting political power. You know, what made the boycott work of Wonder Bread was that we had block captains. And those block captains had a relationship with the people on their block. And we had African American ministers in every single black church in Boston who had a relationship with their congregations. And it's relationships that are the basic unit of power. And organizations are structured relationships, and organizations is what holds, keeps, and builds power that you can then use in a variety of ways. I think in general, I think it is fair to say we're in a race right now, It's a race I'm feeling a lot better about the last couple of weeks. But the race is, on the one hand, the authoritarians who control the federal government are using the control of the federal government to enhance their power and to destroy as many centers of opposition and critical and independent thought as possible. And we, the forces trying to defend democracy, are in a race to build our lasting political power and to be able to withstand their assaults and then ultimately to get them out of office and get them out of power. It's a race.
It is a race. And in the balkanization of the media, which we've all been watching, the evolution of Substacks has been profound, because even though there's going to be a right Substack, there's also going to be a strong now left Substack,
Right.
Against the kind of perhaps less respectful from some people's perspective news, and an opportunity to really get the truth out to people. And that's been so interesting to watch, isn't it? It's kind of like having captains out there, doing some work for us that otherwise, it's a little harder to do, and at least from the context of sitting here in Concord.
Right.
You have been unafraid of taking on potentially losing battles. And I'm going to use the example of Professor Stuart Hughes in his quest for a Senate seat against Kennedy in 1962. What do you learn, and what can we learn from taking on battles even when they may not be obviously victorious? Where is the stamina on which each of us must call, Michael, and how do you find it?
So I think there are two things wrapped up there, Diane. One is the willingness to take on battles that are hard and difficult and that you may lose. And when I always think about that is, I think not, are you absolutely going to win or lose, but are you going to advance? Are you going to build political power? Are you going to organize new people? Are you going to educate new people? And ultimately, what we need in this country is democratic, small d, renewal, and that means democratic organization across all of society. And so a campaign, an electoral campaign, an issue campaign, shouldn't be judged purely by whether you'll win or lose, but will it advance popular organization. Personally, I think you have to make the choice of hope. And well, how many people have felt a little despair this last year? Yeah. Not at all unreasonable.
Yeah.
But it's why we need hope. Because if we don't have hope, then we become passive, we give in, and we start to obey. And so what is hope? Well, hope is not a prediction. Hope is not certainty. Hope is not the knowledge that you are going to win. It's a choice. It's a choice to work and fight for what is good and decent. And it's a reasonable choice for one irrefutable fact. The future is not predetermined. The future is not set. What will happen in 2026 is not determined now. Either way, by the way. Either way, it's not automatic that we're going to win. What's going to happen in 2028 is not determined. And there are certainly great forces at work, social, technological, economic, political, that are shaping things. But one of those great forces is the aggregate actions that all of us and millions of us around the country will take or not take. And so I think we need to think about hope as an active choice. And again, believe that because the future is not predetermined, we have agency. And when we band together, we have even more agency. And that belief, and I always go back, I go back, Rosa Parks. She was not the first black woman to refuse to give up her seat. And when she just made that choice in 1955, she had no idea that within 10 years, the long system of legal segregation in the South would be ended by a powerful, powerful movement. You can't tell. I mean, you can analyze, you can strategize, but you can't tell. What you can do is make the choice
And
to
continue.
have hope,
Right.
and then do the hard work of making it real.
That's as inspirational as any, as any sermon that we could receive in any setting. We've watched the struggles of Harvard and other leading universities in the country as they face assaults from DC. We have also read concerns about the integrity of their public statements and the pressures on faculties. You had close relationships with faculty and administrators at Harvard when you were organizing as an undergraduate. And you were astonished, to be honest, by the hypocrisy. I'm not going to break the equipment, Fred, I promise. And you were astonished, to be honest, by the hypocrisy of some of the august leaders that surrounded you. Can you tell us about one such experience and what you learned from it? And in particular, what do we learn about adults and how we trust them, and leaders and how we trust them? And what are your present sympathies and our concerns with university administrators? I know that's a huge question.
That's a huge question,
Yeah.
yes. Well, I'll try and take it in order. So, what I found over and over again at Harvard in the 1960s is that the administration had absolutely no understanding of their students, what motivated us, what concerned us, and could not communicate with us. There was one dean, John Monroe, who could, and tellingly, he quit Harvard to go work at a historically black college in the South. And with him went any chance of us having any dialogue. I'll give you an example that just is symbolic to me, may not mean as much to you. I graduated in 1968. We had asked that the class day speaker be Martin Luther King, and he'd been assassinated that spring. So we had his widow come for class day. But Harvard, the Harvard administration, decided that it would give the principal honorary degree to the Shah of Iran, who we viewed as a murderous, modernizing dictator. We had friends in the Iranian Student Association who had relatives and friends who had been thrown out of the top window of SAVAK, the secret police headquarters in Tehran. And we absolutely said, you can't do this. And Harvard said, of course we can, we will, and you should be honored to have this great man come to your commencement. And I just thought, they are so out of touch with the world and, of course, with how we would think.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the classic story when in 1969, we occupied University Hall. I had graduated, but I was brought back. And Harvard had said the following things. We have no contracts with the Central Intelligence Agency. We have no defense contracts related to Vietnam in any way, shape, or form. And we will allow the faculty to make its decision about whether we keep the Reserve Officer Training Program or not. When we took University Hall, I blush to admit it, but I organized a small detail to seal off the dean's offices. We said to everybody else, we don't want to go in there, we don't want to disturb them, we don't want anyone thinking that we're breaking and entering. And then our little squad went in, and we sent out for someone who would get a drill, because we thought we could drill the locked file cabinets. And then we made this miraculous discovery, which is a steel case file cabinet. If you take a metal bookend, those metal flat bookends, turn it on its side, pop it in, it pops the lock and the drawer opens. So we opened every single file cabinet that we could, and we stole mail. And what did the mail show? Multiple contracts with the Central Intelligence Agency, massive contracts, including the Project Phoenix, which murdered 40,000 civilians, contract with the Defense Department, and multiple letters between Pusey and the deans about how they were going to lie to the faculty and circumvent their making a decision about ROTC. And so, the gulf between administrators and students was just enormous. Okay, now fast forward to today. Well, a couple of comments. The first is, I wasn't in any way involved in the encampments around Gaza and didn't agree with much of their approach. But I was stunned to find university administrators still responding to them as if an encampment of tents was somehow violence. Just, I think over all these years, you've never learned. Anyway, then come the attacks because the Trump administration is following the absolute classic authoritarian playbook. And that is, you have to destroy and bring to heel any independent center of thought and research. And so I helped in a very small way with something called Crimson Courage, which is an organization of alums that first formed to pressure Harvard to stand up, and then was delighted when Harvard did, and continues to support them and say, continue to stand up. It did take a little practice. I went to Alumni Day, and we had stickers that we were giving to thousands of people saying Crimson Courage. It did take me a little practice before the mirror to say, I'm here today to support the Harvard administration. That didn't come naturally to me, but we did. And then from that, we have built the beginnings of an emergency campaign for higher education that brings alumni, students, faculty, and staff, including unionized staff, together in a national campaign. And what we're trying to do, though, is hard, not only to bring all those groups together, but also we can't win this fight if we just restrict it to defense of academic freedom and free speech and academic autonomy. And the reason we can't is because of the larger strategic dilemma that we're in when we resist Trump. Trump is the destroyer. He's destroying so much, we need to defend against his destruction. But if we become defenders of the status quo, we are defending a failed status quo, and we will lose. We won't get the popular support across the country, including with working class voters of all races, that we need to win. So take higher education. We have to defend against Trump's destruction. We have to defend university autonomy. We have to defend academic freedom. We have to defend free speech. And we have to say higher education has to be more accessible and work for everybody, not just the elites. Can we make community college free everywhere? Can we make sure that student debt gets dealt with, et cetera, et cetera? I'm waiting for us to talk about legacy admissions, but no one's picked up on that one yet. So again, it's this dilemma of we have to resist what Trump is destroying, but we also can't become the defenders of a failed status quo.
And I'll ask so many other questions. I'm going to ask one quick last question, then we'll give everybody else chances to ask questions, Michael. And there are probably people online. Fred, are people asking questions online? Is there a chat box where? Okay, terrific. After you stopped the Vietnam War, thank you very much, single-handedly, and your other work in areas like Fair Share, and I've just recently learned of new engagements, which I hope you will tell us about, do they grow out of the Crimson Courage? Because I keep getting this in my mailbox and keep reading what's going on, but they grow out of that. But before we go there, Michael, so many in this audience care passionately about successful engagement. We watch somewhat helplessly as trillionaires diminish the lives of so many, and their comrades in D.C. marginalize our democratic rule of law. What mistakes would you counsel us to avoid that you are aware of in the work that you did? And then this wonderful advice of hope. Is there something else you wish to add to that? But what mistakes are you kind of aware of that you wish, that you warn us to avoid?
So there are so many mistakes. And one of the reasons I wrote the memoir was in a non-didactic way. It's memoir, it's not history, to recount some of those in the hope that organizers and activists
today can learn. The one that haunts me the most is the election of 1968. If you remember, it was a wild year, absolutely wild year, in which anything seemed possible. It started with the Tet Offensive. It then went on to Johnson saying he wouldn't run and us having hope and that peace negotiations would start. Then the assassination of Martin Luther King and the National Guard sent into every black community across the country, which was rioting and in insurrection. It went on to around the world, the Prague Spring and socialism with a human face, with students uprising in Germany and in France. And then not only did the students walk out in France, but 20-some million workers walked out in France. And then the Columbia Revolt, and on, and then the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, and then the convention, Democratic Convention and the
Which
police
you chose
rights.
not to attend, right?
Yeah, I had been asked to help organize, and you know, the strategy that, quote, strategy that we had was we'd move from bring the troops home to bring the war home, and somehow that was going to work. But Tom Hayden had come and Rennie Davis and asked me to help put together a New England organizing committee to bring people to Chicago, and I first said yes and started to do that, but the more I went through with Tom and Rennie the planning, the more it was obvious to me that it was going to provoke a violent police response. And it bothered me immensely that we were not being explicit with the people that were coming about the risks that they faced. And so I argued with Tom, couldn't persuade him, and finally said, okay, I'm not going to bring people to Chicago, but I'm certainly not going to say that people shouldn't come. And then out of Chicago, we get the campaign between Hubert Humphrey, sad, corrupted, not breaking with the war, sold his soul to become vice president, and Richard Nixon, another paranoid, insecure person who had no respect for the Constitution of the United States. And my response, along with all of my friends, was this: the lesser of two evils is still evil. I believe that, by the way. I believe the lesser of two evils is still evil. But I also think that's irrelevant. That's not about strategy. I said, vote with your feet, vote in the street, and organized protest marches on Election Day for the election that was one of the absolute closest in American history, closer even than the one in 2024. We were not wrong about Humphrey, but we were absolutely wrong about Nixon and the damage that he would inflict. And I carry today the knowledge that even though the voting age was 21, and so lots of our followers would have been too young, we probably could have swung that election to Humphrey. And I believe that as bad as Humphrey was, as sad as Humphrey was, we would have had an excellent chance of pressuring him to stop the war that we did not have with Nixon. And the result was that 2 million, let me say that again, 2 million people in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos died. And that responsibility is on those of us who made the decision, the lesser of two evils is still evil. Do not work to stop Nixon. And with Nixon adopting the Southern strategy, he started the Republican Party on the long march to the party of white grievance and to Trump. And I think, you know, you never know. Counterfactual history is just a set of guesses. I think we could have won the election. And I think we could have changed history. And we chose not to. And so what I draw from that is that for those of us who care about justice and care about democracy, we can't indulge our sort of personal feelings. We have to be strategic. We have to be rigorous. We have to say, what is not the path that we want, but what is the path that can get us closer to where we need to be? You know, there were 15 million people who voted for Biden in 2020 who didn't cast a ballot at all in 2024.
Yeah.
If they had voted, it would have changed everything. Many of them share our views. And so, again, my lesson is strategy, strategy, strategy at all times, and not compromise in principles, not compromise in passion, but be rigorous in figuring out how to win what we have to win and make the choices that are hard but are necessary.
Michael, thank you so much. Sandra Day O'Connor, I know, is haunted by a similar moment when she chose to say, all right, Bush had won.
Right.
And, we can consider what the world would have been like, had that not happened. These pivotal moments when one voice and one vote, at least of one that was thinking about it and regrets it to this day, there are moments like that, I suspect, in each of our lives, Michael, and you've done so much good. We should not really, should I have done that all along? I should have had it louder. Okay. Thank you. So let's get some questions from the audience.
We have a couple of questions online, and then we'll take some from the audience. The first one is a compound question. What would you say contributed most to the success of the anti-Vietnam War and the civil rights movements, protests, things, contacting legislative representatives, whatever? Do you think that success was easier because these were one-issue movements? And should we rebuild our pro-democracy movement as one issue, such as this is not American?
So, there were lots of factors in the success of the civil rights movement, but the most important was both the moral clarity and the strategic clarity of the movement. And there's a wonderful book that I would recommend that people read. It's by Thomas Ricks, who is a military historian. Does anyone know him, his work?
Could you spell his last name for us?
Ricks, R-I-C-K-S.
Okay.
He's the preeminent military historian in America. Writes the reviews in the New York Times Book Review of all their military books. And he wrote a book called The Good War, which is bringing a military historian's view of the civil rights movement and discussing their strategic choices that they made and how their campaigns were structured, planned, and implemented, and why it was that they were able to win. So I always go back to organizing and strategy. I'm a kind of one-trick pony. Organizing strategy, organizing strategy. With the anti-war movement, we made lots of mistakes, and ultimately what did end the war was the war itself, the facts of the war being brought into everyone's living rooms, and the fact that there was a voice of opposition. If there hadn't been that voice of opposition, the facts alone wouldn't have mattered, but we could have done so much better. So I think today, the pro-democracy movement needs to do many things. And I wouldn't say it needs to reduce itself to one focus or one strategy. We need to fight authoritarianism everywhere. And so we need to fight it in colleges and universities. So those of you who are college graduates, if you haven't done two things, you really should. One, write a letter to your college president urging them to stand up and be in solidarity with the other colleges and universities. But even more importantly, reaching out to your friends from college and asking them to join you in writing that letter. Organizing, organizing, organizing. If there are any lawyers listening, I have been very much waiting for the Boston and Massachusetts bar associations to speak out regularly, saying that what Trump is doing is illegal and unconstitutional, and that just because he signs something doesn't make it law. And so where are our lawyers organizing And I could go on and on. We need to fight across every possible social institution. Then the other thing that we need to do, which is quite clear, is that we need to win the 26 elections. And we need to win them decisively. And we need, groups like Concord Indivisible to keep doing what it's doing and mobilizing people to make sure that we win those elections. And one of the critical things about winning those elections, which is not Concord Indivisible's job to do, but is the movement writ large, is to reach working class voters. And we know the way to reach working class voters. It's around affordability and costs. It's around health care. It's around the cost of electricity. And we don't have to make an appeal about climate change. We can simply point out that utilities should be buying the cheapest electricity possible. What is that? That is solar and wind, right? And when New Jersey faces an energy spike because they've decommissioned 2 old nuclear plants, and then Trump destroys the almost built offshore wind factory, we need to take that to working class voters and saying, this is why your electricity bill has gone up 6 times in recent months in New Jersey. By the way, huge impact on the most recent elections in New Jersey, because Mickey Sherrill did that and said, I will declare an energy emergency once I'm elected, and I will deal with the cost of electricity. So we need to do all of those things. Long answer to probably what was a simpler question. I'm sorry.
No, that was great. Second question, did we learn anything and what and how to go forward based on the Occupy Wall Street movement going nowhere?
So I think the Occupy
Did you all hear that question? Okay.
So I think the Occupy Wall Street movement was raising really critical and profound issues that have not been resolved and that need to be resolved. As long as we have this enormous inequality of wealth in the country, and by the way, the fiction that corporations are people and have the right to spend as much money on elections as they want, we will not make progress on any of the things that we care about. I will say, though, I was sorry to see Occupy repeat many of the mistakes I thought I had already made. Of course, I hadn't written my memoir then. And one of those in particular was, we have no leaders here. We have no leaders here. Well, that's just wrong. Any movement, any organizing effort, any cause has leaders. The question is, are they good leaders? Are they accountable leaders? And do they develop more leaders and empower the people around them? And the degree to which movements say, I have no leader here, they don't develop the structures for good leadership, the practice of good leadership, and they diminish their power. And, it is essential that everything that we do builds organized political power. And you can't do that unless you're developing leaders and moving people up a ladder of engagement and creating organizations with more and more structured relationships.
Michael, I'm just going to challenge you a little bit on
Yep.
that. Do you think that's a male construct?
No, I think, in
Wait, no,
fact,
let me go
no,
let me
no.
see why. I mean, I wonder, because I think there are women who might or might suggest that a cadre of powerful people working together collaboratively can be, and particularly if they communicate well, just as effective as a singular leader.
So you assumed
that don't accuse me of assuming.
No,
Go ahead.
you assumed that when I said leaders or leader, I meant one,
Okay.
typically male.
I wasn't suggesting
No, but
that
hang
male.
on a minute, because this is critical. Here's where I learned the tyranny of structurelessness. It was from the early feminists, who pointed out that when we have no accountable leaders, the most aggressive and articulate and self-confident people will appear to lead. Mm-hmm. By the way, that perfectly describes myself at SDS, which is not being elected to things, not held accountable, but always being confident, articulate, able to outtalk anybody. So when I say leadership, I don't mean star leaders, and I don't think of leadership as something that is a set of attributes. And I do believe you can have collective leaders and you have teams, but if you still think we don't have any leaders here, you're going to end up weakening what you're doing. And so what we want are leaders who empower others, we want leaders who are collaborative, and we want leaders who are accountable.
Well said.
And we'd like to take questions from the floor. And I'll bring the mic to you. I have one here and one there.
So, hi, I'm Glenn Cody. I'm activist at heart, so I'm in my right place. I'm on the school committee in Acton. One thing that I've encountered over years in organizing and being around mainly left-leaning organizing spaces is a lot of the dysfunction that you've alluded to. And I guess just from not necessarily about a structural strategic thing, but on an individual, how do you navigate these spaces on an emotional individual level? I find that with a lot of these spaces, I feel myself just this sense of, what are you idiots doing? And that's not a good energy to come into a space with. And it's also often very pervasive because, there's been some incredible work, and then sometimes I look at these spaces and I'm in my, we're in the 5th meeting and and this isn't just in activist spaces, but it's this is the 5th meeting we've had about this subject. This could have been an email and a decision 7 weeks ago.
Can you get right to the question?
How do you deal with the emotional contempt of this tyranny of structurelessness in a way that you can navigate these spaces effectively to actually build the power instead of just going what is anyone doing? I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Michael.
I'm not sure I have a great response. I tend to feel find the right group or start the right group. Don't waste a lot of time unless the group is willing to be trained. And there are lots of wonderful trainers, particularly in Massachusetts. There's a whole network of trainers out of Harvard with Marshall Gans, and I recommend his work and their training highly. I wouldn't waste a lot of time being frustrated. We're in a desperate fight right now, in which we're in the worst crisis the country's ever seen since the Civil War. And so we need people to spend their time doing effective work, not wasting time, and certainly not being frustrated with each other, and certainly not sparring with each other. The times call for us to do more and to do it better. And if you're in a group or a space that is really frustrating, I guess my only advice is to find another one. And I'm sorry if that's not better, but it's desperate times, and desperate times call for desperate measures. I just don't know what exactly they are.
We can take 1 or 2 more questions.
Do you have any suggestions on how we in Massachusetts can help support parts of the country that need support in trying to vote democratically?
Yeah. So I think there's been a lot that we've learned about remote volunteer, and that there's a lot that we can do, if done well, that have marginal impacts, but marginal impacts should not be discounted. And so that's the full range of postcarding and texting and phone banking, or going to New Hampshire or going to New York. There are going to be critical races in New Hampshire. There are going to be critical races not that far away in New York. For instance, New York Congressional District 17 is a several-hour drive. So all those things, I think, are really important and should be done. My own theory at the moment is that the most important thing that remote volunteers can be doing is to be working with local organizations and local campaigns in those swing districts and making calls to recruit volunteers. So not calling the general voting population, which, as we all know, is brutal and hard, but calling into the most sympathetic voters in a district in association with a local organization or a local campaign, and saying things like, in North Carolina, the Mecklenburg Democratic Party would like to invite you to a social gathering next Friday night. I think in 2024 they recruited something like 1,400 volunteers that way. And so I think that's the single most effective thing, because what really works in terms of field organizing is to have local people talking to their friends and their neighbors and their community. And the more that we have local people doing the organizing work, we're going to win elections. And so the best thing, I think, just my own view, that we can do as remote volunteers is to help organizations recruit those volunteers in the districts, in the states.
Thank you very much. Scott and Jen back there has a question. And those will be the last two.
Thanks, Michael. Apologies if you get to this in the book, because I haven't got there yet. But can you go back and talk about when you started SDS, you said you had a critique of the left at that time, and you were going to be the new left. And you said, obviously, we had issues with the communists, the Trotskyists. But talk to me about what your issues were with the straight Marxists. And the reason I ask this is because you can listen to Mamdani talk, and you can hear affordability.
Yeah.
But what's right underneath there, indeed sometimes parallel, is class struggle.
Yeah.
100%, Scott.
So what was your gripe with, why didn't you just go the straight Marxist route?
I can tell you why. I believe in class struggle, by the way, so that wasn't the issue. The issue is that the old left was over-determinist, and that over-determinist. In other words, they didn't pay enough attention to consciousness. How do people come to understand their collective situation? Because what you have to do as an organizer is you have to get people to see that their individual problems are shared problems. And for rigid Marxists, that's all a product of the contradictions and will happen. And you just need the vanguards to lead. Whereas I believe that you need not vanguards, but organizers, and organizers don't speak for people. They empower people to speak and do for themselves, which then goes into what kind of society you're trying to build, one in which the vanguard controls the state and the state controls the economy and institutions, or one in which we're expanding democracy and workers have a bigger share of decision-making in their workplaces, residents have a bigger share of decision-making in their community, students have a bigger share of decision-making in their universities. So it was a holistic critique that started with overdeterminism, and then went through to what's the goal, which needs to be less status, less vanguard, and more control. And I still believe in that today.
And perhaps too much dialectical determinism.
Yeah.
Jen, would you say that's fair?
Thank you. Michael, your stories are so powerful. Imagining you as a young man doing this incredible organizing. And so it makes me think right away about what are young people doing today? When you came in, you were telling a story about meeting with students. And so I'd love this to end on some hopeful perspective from you about young people. Are you seeing organizing happening? What are you mentoring, many of us are wringing our hands wondering where the young people are and how we can get them engaged. What's your perspective?
All right, so let me give you two specific responses. So the first is the Mamdani campaign.
Yep.
And everybody knows, exceptional candidate, absolutely right message, great use of social media. What people don't know about are two other factors. One was the public financing in New York. He could never have won without the public financing law, useful thing that gives up to an 8-to-1 match for small donations. But the real thing that people don't understand nearly enough about is the organizing of young people that produced 100,000 volunteers, $100,000 who were $100,000 volunteers who were predominantly young, and they transformed the electorate. They knocked millions of doors. They talked to their peers, and I don't know the general election statistics, but I do know the primary election statistic, which is that for the first time in the history of New York elections, ever, 50% of the electorate in the primary was under the age of 45. And that's because they had those tens of thousands of young volunteers who showed that they will respond to a call that is clear, that is hopeful, that is relevant to them, and that has moral clarity and political imperative. I spent the weekend in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was at a first pilot training boot camp for young students, college students. There were 60 of them from pretty much the Midwest, but other parts of the country as well. And it's part of the higher education emergency campaign that I met. And Jen, I wish I could have taken all of you with me. First, they are very serious about organizing. I kept thinking, when I was organizing, I was making this stuff up. The only examples I had was the civil rights movement. And here were young trainers who really have studied the craft and technique of organizing and were determined to train people in how to be effective. They are passionate, they are smart, and they are determined to organize a majority of their campuses over the next couple of years. The other thing that I wish I could transport you into that hall. Every break, every single break, they sang and they chanted together. And I hadn't experienced that since the civil rights movement. And their songs, by the way, were all original. They'd written them themselves. Their chants were all original. They developed them themselves. And they were so affirming and creative that I felt a new wave of hope. And I just, it's starting. That's all I can say. It's starting. Young people are beginning
Wake up.
to organize.
That is so encouraging, Michael. I've spent thousands of questions to ask you about globalization and questions about religion. There's so many. We could spend hours with you. You know so much, and your wisdom has been pervasive tonight. Speaking of music, the moment in reading his book that drew me right back to everything was his citation, and I'm going to just read this to you. On the fourth day of the conference, a young Bob Dylan came by to shyly mingle and ask if he could volunteer on the project. By then, most of us had resonated to Dylan's words and music. I'll soon shake the windows and rattle your walls, for the times they are a-changin'. And when he sang, come mothers and fathers throughout the land, don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. He was singing for us. The old road was rapidly changing and aging. Soon each of us could and would shout, please get out of the way of the new one if you can't lend a hand, because the times were certainly changing. And I hope you all get a copy of this book. If that music